Chair calls the Senate General Investigating Committee on the July 2025 flooding events to order. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Flores.
Present.
Vice Chair Perry.
Present.
Senator Hughes.
Here.
Senator Colhorst.
Here.
Senator Menendez.
Present.
A quorum is present. Members, our first order of business is to adopt the committee rules. Each office has received an advance copy of the proposed committee rules, and you've been provided with a physical copy for reference. Members, do you have any questions? So the chair hears none. Senator Perry moves adoption of the committee rules. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Flores.
Aye.
Vice Chair Perry.
Present. Aye.
Thank you. Senator Hughes.
Yes.
Senator Colhorst.
Aye.
Senator Menendez.
Aye.
5 ayes, no nays.
There'll be 5 ayes and 0 nays. The committee rules have been adopted. Chairman Meyer.
The House General Investigating Committee on the July 2025 flooding events will now come to order. The clerk will call the roll.
Chair Meyer.
Here.
Vice Chair Moody.
Present.
Representative Darby.
Present.
Representative Dyson.
Here.
Representative Gomez.
Here.
Quorum is present. I believe Chair Flores has an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. Members, we're here today to examine in detail an unimaginable tragedy that occurred in the Texas Hill Country on July the 4th, 2025. Among the many lives lost were 27 vibrant young girls from one camp, Camp Mystic. This marks the single largest loss of children's lives in Texas due to a natural disaster since the Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900. Texas's grief is deep and enduring. 10 months later, as investigations continue and recommendations are pursued, this event remains etched into our collective conscience. One truth stands above all. We cannot change what happened, but we can change how we prepare for and respond to the next emergency. For the families who lost loved ones, for a community that lost its sense of safety, and for those who feel a profound loss of innocence, the questions about what should happen next are many. But for me, one thing is clear. This tragedy could have been prevented. Our goal with this investigative committee is to examine the facts, understand where failures occurred, and determine what must be done to ensure that it never happens again. Finally, I want to express my appreciation to Lieutenant Governor Patrick, Speaker Burrows, Chairman Meyer, and the committee investigators, and the members of both committees. The work required here is difficult, it's serious, and deeply important. It is being undertaken with the gravity and the diligence it deserves. Chairman Meyer.
Thank you, Chairman Flores. Good morning, and thank you for being here. Whether in this room or watching from home, we know that for many of you, this is not an easy day. First, I want to thank Speaker Burrows and Lieutenant Governor Patrick for their leadership in ensuring that this committee was established and given the authority necessary to carry out a thorough and independent review. I also want to recognize Governor Abbott for his commitment to ensuring this investigation moves forward with urgency and transparency. We are here today because of the lives lost and families forever changed by the devastating flooding that struck Central Texas in July of 2025, and in particular, because of the tragedy at Camp Mystic. Those children and the families who entrusted them to that place deserve answers. Our responsibility is clear: to determine what happened. That means building a complete, accurate account of the events, the decisions made, and the timeline of what unfolded. The facts must be established with clarity and without omission. Next, our job is to assess preparedness and response. We will examine whether the systems, protocols, and personnel in place were adequate, and whether they functioned as they should when lives were on the line. That includes the actions of agencies, officials, and individuals at every level. This committee will follow the facts wherever they may lead, including examining decisions made before, during, and after the flooding, to understand whether more could have been done and what must be improved moving forward. I want to express my appreciation for the investigators chosen to assist this committee. Casey Garrett and Judge Michael Massengale bring a high level of professionalism, integrity, and experience to this process, and we are grateful for their service and dedication to uncovering the facts. To Chairman Flores and his committee, thank you for your leadership and collaboration as we work across chambers to get answers for the people of Texas. And to my fellow committee members, I am grateful for your willingness to serve in this capacity. The gravity of this work is real, and I believe each of you feels it. It will continue to demand diligence, fairness, and an unwavering commitment to getting this right. Finally, to the families who lost loved ones and the communities that are still healing, we understand that no proceeding can undo what has been lost. The grief you carry is immeasurable, and the courage it takes to be here or to watch from home is not lost on us. This moment carries real weight, and we do not take it lightly. What we can offer and are committed to is a process grounded in accountability, transparency, and a full examination of the facts. You deserve to know exactly what happened and why. This committee will not rest. I guarantee you, we will not rest until we have done everything within our power to provide that. Thank you. Members, does anyone wish to say anything? Speaker Moody.
Thank you, Chairman Meyer, Chairman Flores, and echo everything that you all said. The amount of trauma and tragedy that came down in the Hill Country last year is something that still very hard to comprehend. And there's nothing, and you all have said this, there's nothing that legislators can do to change that. And that does, I think, at times make us feel very helpless. But I think the goals of what the chairman have both stated it is what we're here to do. And I know we're going to hear from some folks that have suffered the largest loss that we could ever imagine. But our task in front of us is what we can do to prepare better, to make sure that in crisis the response is adequate, and that in the aftermath of a crisis we are caring for people and not re-traumatizing them. I also know, and I want to, I appreciate everybody mentioning our investigators and the team that went out there, because the painful stories that we have heard and will hear have all been channeled through this team. And it was 4 years ago, almost to the day here, when I first met Casey, Mike, and their team, when we went down to Uvalde. Casey, when I saw you last week, all of that rushed back, I know, for you and for me. So as we hear from Casey today, just understand she's asked to do this work because she is brilliant and she is hardworking and she knows how to get to the truth of the matter. But she is a human being who is absorbing a lot of very difficult information, seeing things and hearing things that no one should have to. And I want to thank you for your work and your team for your work, because it's incredibly difficult what you do. But I want to say thank you. And just as we go through today, just know that we are here to support you in all the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker Moody. Members, any other? All right, thank you. Today we will hear from the investigators tasked to examine the 2025 flooding event and to produce the briefing that we will see today. Members of the public can leave comments through the comment portal linked on both meeting notices online and posted outside the committee room. Members, I'd ask that you limit questions if possible during the investigators' presentation. There will be an opportunity for extensive questions and answers afterwards, and many of your questions may be addressed in the presentation itself. With that, the chair calls the investigators, Casey Garrett and Judge Michael Massengale, to present their findings.
Chairman Meyer, Chairman Flores, members of the committee, it's good to see you all again, and good morning. Thank you, Representative Moody, for those incredibly kind words. It means a lot to me. We did get quite close 4 years ago in Uvalde in very unfortunate circumstances, but I cannot thank you enough for those very, very kind words. As you know, my name is Casey Garrett. This is Michael Massengale. You guys have asked us to do a factual an objective investigation into the July 4th, 2025 flooding event. You specifically charged us with limiting our scope to the events at Camp Mystic, with some context leading up to and shortly after those critical hours at Camp Mystic. Obviously, I don't have to tell you that there's a lot of people that want the investigation to be more wide-ranging. Obviously, I leave that up to the legislature to take care of. I just want to make clear that our marching orders were to focus on the scope that you gave us, and we have done that. As Representative Moody pointed out, the way I got involved in this investigation was that 4 years ago I got a call from now Speaker Burrows to help with the House Legislative Investigative Committee into the Robb Elementary shooting in Uvalde. Judge Massengale was also asked to participate in that, and that's where we became actually really good friends and colleagues. And I'm thankful for that experience. It was difficult, and I never dreamed that there'd be another mass casualty of children bigger than what happened in Uvalde. But here we are. I'd also like to introduce Heather McFarland and Kim Parks, also members of our team. Kim and I met at the district attorney's office in Houston many, many years ago, 33 years ago. We were both longtime prosecutors, and we're both criminal trial attorneys now. Judge Massengale spent 10 years at Baker Botts, became a partner, then became a justice on the Texas Court of Appeals for 10 years, and is currently in private arbitration practice. Heather has also been an attorney, a civil trial attorney for almost 30 years, and is also involved in mediation and arbitration. Essentially, in a very small but mighty team, you're getting about 120 years of legal experience. All of us, as a living, investigate cases, interview witnesses, and write conclusions and findings, and that's what you're getting from us. This has been a very aggressive timeline, as you know. And we have dedicated really our entire practices to this project over the last few months. And I will say, completely honored, just absolutely honored. When Speaker Burrows called me in the fall to see if we were interested in doing this, it was a hard answer, of course, but it was an easy answer. I'm excited that we have been able to be a part of this public service. So thank you for that opportunity. I do want to point out, I know that you guys are well aware of this, but it bears commenting on. Our presentation today is intended to be strictly factual. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to not bleed over into opinions, but we have tried really hard to keep this as objective and as factual as we possibly can. Unlike the litigation, right? Chairman Flores, you said it so well, this is not about judgment, it's about change. And every single person, including myself, is hungry for you guys to take the call to action and make some change that can make this tragedy at least, make a modicum of sense. So just wanted to point that out before we get started. But I'll just start with some of our source material. That 120 witness interviews is closer to 140 or 150 now. We will continue to interview witnesses as we lead into May and getting the final report written. I have personally interviewed every single family that was impacted by this. I have interviewed every single member of the Eastland family. I have interviewed parents of children that survived from the relevant cabins that children died in. I have interviewed campers. Although I didn't solicit talking to children, some of them wanted to talk to me, and some of their parents wanted them to talk to me. I have spoken with counselors. I have interviewed witnesses in Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, Belleville. I've been on Zoom calls with witnesses from Poland, Maine, Tennessee, Colorado, Alabama. We have spent the last few months interviewing witnesses, and that's the only way to get the information that we need. So we've done that. We have been to Camp Mystic multiple times. Let me back up for 1 second on the witnesses. I would like to say that everybody, for the most part, with a few very minor exceptions, has been completely cooperative. completely cooperative. We have had access to, again, all of the family members. We've had access to all of the Eastlands. All of the lawyers that have been involved have been tremendously cooperative. We've received information from the civil lawyers on both sides. We have really not faced any significant impediments other than people's trauma and not wanting to talk so much about that. So I do want to point out how cooperative everybody has been. We have been to Camp Mystic multiple times. We have done site tours. We were given unfettered access. We did walkthroughs with members of the Eastland family. We didn't feel like we were impeded at all on that. Transcripts of all the hard work that you and some of your colleagues did last summer. That was a lot of really important information. 911 calls, audio witness statements, all the media reporting, newspaper articles, lots of information from the civil suits. Again, the lawyers have all been really helpful with this process. Reviewing information from both sides. We've attended as many court hearings as we can, and we've reviewed transcripts from those court hearings, which again have been provided to us by the lawyers. And then, of course, you guys know, and you know from the Uvalde experience, what a brilliant writer Judge Massengale is. He's been working on a preliminary report as we have been giving him information for this entire time. So you're going to see a really well-written report. Let's talk about Camp Mystic, because to understand some of this story, you have to understand Camp Mystic. And I think one of the things that helped me in this process is that I didn't know anything. I didn't know much about, I mean, obviously I know about the hill country, but I didn't know much about like the topography and that kind of thing. And I really knew nothing about Camp Mystic. Everything I know about Camp Mystic now, I learned from people in this room. But it's important, right? Because it's actually, what I learned is it's a culture. It's a thing. It's a very big part of people's lives. It is a private Christian camp for girls, located on approximately 720 acres. Again, having been out there, it's absolutely beautiful. It's just absolutely beautiful property. I can see why people have loved it for 100 years. It's absolutely beautiful. It was formed in 1926, again, 100 years ago. It was bought in 1939 by the Eastland family. It was run for many years by a beloved couple named Ine and Frank Harrison. When Dick and Tweety Eastland graduated from college, they moved to Camp Mystic to begin learning how to run it. They worked under Mrs. Eastland explained to us that they worked under the tutelage of Ine and Frank Harrison until they began to take over the camp in approximately 1987. It is currently separated into two campuses, the Cypress Lake campus and the Guadalupe River campus. The Cypress Lake campus is newer. I believe it was built in approximately 2019 and opened in 2020. And the Guadalupe River campus, of course, has existed since 1926. Some important things about Mystic, right? It's touted as rustic. It is rustic. It's absolutely beautiful. It's completely communing with nature when they're out there. There's no air conditioning. There's no cell phones. These are long sessions that these girls go. They go for a month. They have very limited contact with parents. It's deeply religious, and it's definitely what I've learned is what I would call sort of an obedience-encouraged culture. These aren't bad things, right? It's not bad or good. It's wonderful for your child to be able to disconnect from cell phones, right? And really everybody I talked to, including the counselors, said we loved not having cell phones. We loved having an excuse to disconnect. So it's not a criticism that they didn't have cell phones, it's just a fact. So regarding the obedience culture, again, that's not a bad thing. We want to teach our children to follow rules. We want to teach them to learn how to win or lose. We want to teach them to be part of teams and tribes, and that was very encouraged at Camp Mystic. But it was a play-by-the-rules situation. And again, I say that factually from multiple interviews of people that said things like, I would have gotten in trouble if I knew I couldn't do that because it broke the rules. I mean, it was a very rule-oriented obedience culture. And I think that also you'll see played out a little bit as well with the Eastland family and the way the family was run by the patriarch, Dick Eastland. Multi-generational. I mean, there are people in this room whose grandmothers went to Camp Mystic, whose mothers went to Camp Mystic, their aunts, their cousins, their sisters. This is an acceptance letter that Missy Peck received regarding her daughter Lulu. Since she's a relative of a former Mystic girl, she'll be considered a Mystic grandchild. It was an honor. Almost 1/3 of girls are Mystic grandchildren. It is great. Your daughter will be coming to continue the tradition. It was about tradition. It was about legacy. It's not to say that there weren't girls there that went and their mothers didn't go. That certainly did happen. But for sure, the lion's share of the situation was a multi-generational, put your daughter on the wait list at birth. This was, wives telling their new husbands that if we have a daughter, she'll go to Mystic. It was a known thing. It was a very traditional culture. So we talked a little bit about the two different campuses. Cypress Lake, and I'm so glad that you members were out there last week so you could get some perspective about what the layout is like. The relevant portion of our investigation is the Guadalupe River campus. So the Guadalupe River campus is, this cursor is kind of sensitive, there we go. This area right here, it's separated into these two major areas, the Flats and Senior Hill. Up this hill is the campus, Cypress Lake campus, that was unaffected for the most part by the floods. So let's talk a little bit about the hierarchy at Camp Mystic. What you're seeing here are the members of Mystic's year-round full-time staff. The executive directors, of course, were Dick Eastland and Tweety Eastland, and the two campuses each had their own directors. Britt Eastland and Katie Eastland were the directors of the Cypress Lake campus, and Edward and Mary Liz Eastland were the directors of the Guadalupe River campus. Mary Liz Eastland is also a registered nurse and was listed as the medical director of the Guadalupe campus for Camp Mystic. Richard Eastland, the eldest brother, and I should mention that Dick and Tweety Eastland had 4 sons, Richard, James, Britt, and Edward. In a terrible tragedy, James Eastland, who was married with young children and working at the camp under the tutelage of his parents, unexpectedly and tragically died in his 30s of an unknown heart condition. And that sort of brought the family all back to the camp. We were told by the Eastlands that when James very unexpectedly and tragically died, Britt Eastland, who was working as an attorney in San Antonio, and Katie, who was working as a teacher, came back to assist the family in the wake of James's death. Richard Eastland is the head chef and kitchen supervisor. He's responsible for feeding hundreds and hundreds of girls 3 times a day over the period of the summer. Craig Althouse and Betsy Althouse were longtime personal friends of Dick and Tweety. Their kids grew up together. Dick and Tweety asked Craig and Betsy to come live on the property and work on the property many, many years ago, 25 years ago, I believe. And Craig became director of operations, in charge of all the maintenance and the grounds, and Betsy became an assistant director working in the office. So this makes up the sum total of the full-time, year-round personnel for Camp Mystic. We learned, of course, that naturally when camp was in session, they had seasonal staff. So during camp seasons, you had Glenn Yankee and Lee Poole acting as night watchmen. Glenn Yankee tells us that he's a retired HPD officer who moved back to the area with his wife, and in approximately 2021 began working as a night watchman during the summertime, during summer camp sessions, working 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. patrolling the campus. another local man named Lee Poole, I believe, shared that responsibility with Glenn Yankee. Frances Blackwell Loper is a full-time teacher in Lubbock, Texas, and in 2022, I believe, she started working in the summers as the gatekeeper. Frances's mother went to Mystic, Frances went to Mystic, Frances's daughter went to Mystic, and Frances very much, she tells me, wanted her granddaughter to go to Mystic, and she knew that if she was there working in the summer, that might work out well. So Frances was a beloved employee that worked in the summer at the front gate. Every summer, Mary Liz would hire nursing staff. We are aware of 3 nurses that were living on site for the summer. They are listed here. Support crews. Britt is in charge of hiring grounds crew. They obtain J-1 visas for a group of people from Mexico, group of men that have also become a little bit of a generational cycle through Mystic. Fathers and sons and uncles and nephews continue to come back year after year to work the summer session as grounds crew. The kitchen workers, Richard Eastland is in charge of getting J-1 visas for kitchen workers, and over the years he has found that what has worked best is that there is a group of people from Poland that they go through a group called Camp for America. They're young, they're college-age kids typically, who come over for the summer on a J-1 visa to work at the camp as kitchen staff, and then they can also travel in the summer before they go back to Poland. So there were a number of groundskeepers, more than 10, and kitchen workers from Poland. As far as summer leadership positions, they have a group of people called the Big Three. Now, to be clear, these are college girls. These are sophomores and juniors, roughly, in college. They are people that have been typically lifetime campers and have had at least a term as a counselor. So they're called the Big Three: program director, tribe director, and activities director. Sort of the supervisors of the younger counselors, but still college-age girls. Additional staff include college-age photographers and office workers. So this is essentially the sum total of seasonal staff, not including the counselors of each cabin, which we'll get to shortly. Okay, what's important to really know about the dynamic at Mystic was the role that Dick Eastland played as the patriarch of the family. There's no question he was considered the leader of this family and the leader of this camp. By no question, I mean literally everybody describes him in a similar manner, including members of the family, right? He ruled, Tweedy told us. He was large and in charge. He was not stepping back. Mrs. Eastland had already begun kind of pulling back a little bit, turning over a lot of her responsibility to Mary Liz and Katie and others. But Dick was still very much the executive director of the camp. Edward described, if there was an evacuation plan, it was known only to my dad. Richard talks a little bit about, and this may seem silly or minor, but I think it really reflects the deep culture of this, right? They had traditions. There was a tradition that you had vanilla ice cream and fried chicken on Sundays. And if Richard, wanted to change that tradition, that he was going to hear from his dad, is what he tells us. So a lot of micromanaging. And a lot, and to be fair, he was the leader. It was his way or the highway. Britt told us when we asked about the camp joining the American Camp Association, Britt said, I think my dad is just old school. If you have too much regulation, no one is going to want to do this anymore. He would typically win those arguments. Craig described him as Mr. Veto. And they talked about him as the eagle and described him when he was on a tear, the eagle was swooping. Again, just a factual point that he was running the show over there. And in terms of that sort of obedience culture, I know that's a strong word, okay, but you just really didn't really didn't cross him. I mean, it was his word. He ruled, as Mrs. Eastland said. He won those arguments. Heard a lot from counselors about being very afraid of acting. And as you know, that's an issue, right? That we're seeing here is why certain people took action and certain people didn't. Well, they knew, they said things like, I knew I would be in trouble if I tried to take those girls up on that hill. I knew I would be in trouble if I tried to take those girls out in the lightning. I knew I would be in trouble if I ran to the front office in the dark, in the pouring rain, right? And again, to be fair, we want to teach our children to be obedient and respect authority, right? But we want to also, of course, give them the tools to feel like they can take action when they need to. Glenn Yankee describes Dick as the general. The Polish kitchen workers that we interviewed were really crippled with fear of interfering with campers. Naturally, it's no surprise that the male grounds crew were told to stay away from these campers, of course. They were to have no contact with campers, and that makes perfect sense. But same with the kitchen workers. They had limited contact with the girls, and they were afraid they would get in trouble if they interfered. But I also really want to point out, and that the things I'm saying are not an indictment of him. It just describes what was going on there, because he was deeply loved and respected. I mean, people have been very conflicted about their feelings about this family. He taught a generation of girls how to fish. He took them on raids of the kitchen. People adored and loved and respected Dick Eastland. Something that's obviously critically important to this scenario is the communication situation. The way the camp was set up for communications was that certain people had radios, certain people had the walkie-talkies. Dick and Tweety Eastland had a walkie-talkie, Edward and Mary Liz Eastland had one, Britt and Katie had one, Glenn Yankee, the night watchman, had one, Frances Blackwell Loper had one in the front with her into the front gate house. The big three had a radio where they stayed. They stayed in a cabin called Cozy Cabin, which I'll show you. They had a radio. And then there was a radio locked in a cabinet on the riflery range. And the riflery range is on Senior Hill, which that'll make sense in a second when I get to one of these maps. There were a few landlines. There was a landline in the infirmary. There was a landline in the front office. And there were landlines in each of the homes that the Eastlands live on. When you guys were out there with me last week, you saw that they all lived on the property, and I'll show you that as well in a moment. Cell phones. There were no cell phones for campers or counselors. There was Wi-Fi in a limited number of areas. The camp is set up with broadband and fiber. The PA system, the loudspeaker system, there's one by the office, and there's one on Senior Hill, and I believe there's one closer to the pavilion and the twins cabins that we saw when we were out there last week. So as I said earlier, I had to learn a lot about sort of the makeup of the area, and I think that's really important in this equation as well. And one of the ways that I think we're best educated about that is a really good video that was put out by the Upper Guadalupe River Authority in 2017. It's about 10 minutes long. We're going to watch just a portion of it here in a second. But this slide shows that Dick Eastland also thought it was a really informative video, and he sent it to his family and some others, asking them to please watch this video. The video is called Be Flood Aware, and we'll play just a relevant portion here for you.
terrain. It's not flat, so the water rushes down the hills. And if it happens to rain, especially above like the Guadalupe River, get up in the headwaters there where it's really kind of shallow, most areas, and a lot of limestone underneath, then you can get walls of water coming down. It acts like a street, like concrete. It just kind of rushes down. And you can end up, especially if it rains west of Kerrville, up around Hunt and Ingram and westward, with massive walls of water coming down at the same time. So the topography is favorable for water to not just stagnate, but to rush down creeks, rivers, and streams. If you get 3 or 4 inches of rain at one time, that can be a real serious problem.
So I think that does a really good job of explaining why it is an area so well known for flooding and so prone to it. And that leads us to the flood history of the area, which I think is really relevant in just discussing sort of what was known about the area for many, many years. This is a email from Dick Eastland to members of his family and others, talking about some of the flood issues. He says in the bottom of the email, "We've been here for some critical big floods, including 1978, 1984, 2000, and many others." And of course, this just reflects a knowledge by the Eastlands of how flood-prone this area is. And attached to that email at the very bottom there is a link to a summary flood history of Kerr County. And the next few slides are taken from that document that Dick Eastland references in this email about a flood history of that area. It goes way back. And in every one of these slides, we hear about, an astonishing amount of rain, an astonishing amount of damage, an astonishing amount of river rise. 30-foot rise in the upper Guadalupe, threatening to annihilate the village of Ingram. We're back in the early 1900s. In the 20s, a 15-foot rise on Cypress Creek, massive damage to people lose their lives. In the 30s, of course, there's been much talk about the 1932 flood, the catastrophe of, it was a record stage, what they would have called in 1932 an unprecedented flood. 36-foot rise, 4 lives lost, countless buildings washed away, massive financial impact. Most notably is it's one of the earliest and first times that we see Camp Mystic affected by the flooding. 3 cabins, the highlighted portion right here talks about how 3 cabins were washed away in the 1932 flood, 3 cabins that were closer to the waterfront. 1940s and 50s, torrential cloudbursts, millions of dollars in damages, 8 lives lost. Termed the worst flood in 24 years. I mean, we're back in the 40s and 50s, right? That was an unprecedented flood, the worst flood we've had, millions of dollars in damage. We get to the 60s and 70s. Kerr County experienced major rises almost annually. Flooding ceased to be a generational anomaly and became a persistent logistical crisis. This is back in the 60s and 70s. We have known that flooding and flash flooding has been a persistent problem, an impactful problem, a problem that involves the loss of life and massive property damage. 1978 was a massive flood. Dick references it in his email. Camp Mystic was the most severely damaged. Just again, unprecedented rises in the river, massive damage to the area, and specifically damage to Camp Mystic. 1984, congratulations to Dick and Tweedy. I'm sure they will never forget this flood, as Tweedy had to be airlifted by helicopter to the hospital, an experience never to be forgotten. 1987, another major flood in the area that impacted Camp Mystic greatly. That was the year, I believe, that they lost horses in that flood, and girls were evacuated from cabins into Rec Hall in 1987. I have spoken with 2 women who were campers in one of those cabins in 1987, and she remembers, or they both remember, a very similar process that occurred last year where Dick showed up in their cabins in the middle of the night, loaded them up into cars, and took them to Rec Hall. So as early as 1987, Bug House and Look In were evacuated to Rec Hall, and 2 campers in Look In, obviously grown women now, interviewed with me. Part of the camp lore, right? Many people in this room told me about being on Senior Hill when the land bridge would flood, and we liked it because we could stay in our cabins and have food delivered to us by boat. It was novel. It was part of camp lore. This Instagram post, a little flooding on the bridge today. Rain days at camp are the best. Again, this is not, I'm not trying to be negative about this. I'm just saying that it became a very complacent sort of flood culture at Camp Mystic. It was just kind of part of life there. So this is where we have learned a lot about sort of how the camp is situated with respect to waterways. I'm going to get my cursor here. So this is Camp Mystic, right? Right in the middle of this little area. This is the Guadalupe River campus where I'm circling with my cursor. As you go up past these tennis courts and up here, this is the Cypress Lake campus, okay? This is the South Fork of the Guadalupe River, flowing in this direction. This is a little dam right here to sort of dam up the waterfront area where the girls swim. Right here is the waterfront area. The river goes over that dam and flows in this direction. This is Cypress Creek, okay? And it flows in this direction and flows into the Guadalupe right here. Goes out that direction. This is a little bit harder to see. This, well, but you guys were out there, so you have some perspective now. This is Edmondson Creek, also known as Bubblegum Creek. It was nicknamed Bubblegum Creek by the campers, but it's technically known as Edmondson Creek. So you have Edmondson, it's typically either a dry creek bed or just a very small trickle of water. So you have Edmondson Creek flanking the camp, the Guadalupe campus right here. You have Cypress Creek flanking the Guadalupe River campus right here. You have the Guadalupe River right here. And then this, which it's hard to tell because it's not three-dimensional, is a bluff. This is a hill, but I would say hill is kind of a mild description for what it is. It is a rocky bluff that goes up to, at the very peak, what Camp Mystic calls Sky High, where that sort of iconic Mystic sign is at the very top of Sky High. So this is a steep hill, and you can obviously see that if all of these waterways are flooding, this is, I mean, I don't know, you could come up with a lot of words for it. It's a choke point, it's a funnel, it's a river canyon. It's called the Flats. So that gives you some perspective of what the waterways are for Camp Mystic. So now we're going to kind of start to move into the relevant timelines that we've been talking about. It was a really big challenge putting this presentation together because there were so many different areas of the camp that were affected that I think are relevant for your purposes, but we kind of had to split them up into different topics because they were all affected so differently. Each part of the camp, each camper, each cabin had a bit of a different experience. But as far as the common timeline leading into July 3rd and 4th, we're going to start with June 27th to June 29th for the second term. They had already had one term. This was the second summer term for Camp Mystic, and it's when the counselors began to arrive for orientation. One thing that I think is really important to know that I've learned from witness interviews is how things have changed a little bit about counselors. And just a reminder, I'm sure you guys know this, these are young girls. You're eligible to be a counselor the summer after your senior year of high school. So most of them are 18, but some of them are 17. And we have an example of one of the counselors in one of the relevant cabins being 17. So that was okay to be 17 if you had proper supervision. So there's been this move, according to witnesses, from what used to be, I mean, I could just tell you so many people have said, we always had 3 counselors per cabin. We always had, it was rare to see 2 counselors per cabin. We always had 3. And I think what has happened as Cypress Lake opened up and they were, spread thin, they had more cabins to man. As young college students, their lives are changing in modern times. Many of them do study abroad now, or they have internships, or they have reasons why they can't spend the summer as a counselor. So I think that, I don't know this. It seems like hiring of counselors became a challenge based on what witnesses have told me, because many of the counselors, many of the cabins on July 4th, 2025 had 2 counselors. Now, there were several that had 3, but many of them had only 2. And another really important factor that I believe plays into this factually is that those counselors that are eligible to be counselors the summer after their senior year of high school, they are nicknamed ETs, short for counselor ET. That is a junior first-year counselor. A second-year counselor is considered a little bit more senior, right? And you might even have a counselor that's done it for 2 or 3 summers. And then, of course, you have the big 3, as I mentioned, that are still college-age girls, but they are senior counselors. I'm told that it has always been a habit, or and policy might be kind of strong, but certainly a habit to have a senior counselor with an ET. Assigned to a cabin. You weren't going to have 2 ETs alone in a cabin in the past. You were always going to have a senior counselor matched with an ET. Another factor is that in this case, last summer, in the youngest cabins, in Twins 1 and 2 and Bubble, where they were 8 years old, they were first-year campers, those cabins were all manned by ETs. They were all being supervised by first-year counselors. And one of the significant things that I was told that really resonated, obviously, as a mother, is that the 8-year-olds can hardly even wash their own hair, right? They're really high maintenance. They are the most homesick because this is their first year away. Some of them still have, bedwetting issues. They need a lot of supervision in the shower and brushing their teeth. They're very high maintenance. I spoke to a senior counselor who was a counselor on Senior Hill who had a little baby cousin in one of the twins' cabins, and she came down every night to tuck her cousin in, and she saw with her own eyes these counselors struggling with these little babies and saying, oh my gosh, this is so much. Because when the counselors have their nights off, which they all have a schedule of nights off, then an ET will be left alone for several hours with little 8-year-old girls that are very high maintenance. And so this counselor expressed to leadership, hey, I think these counselors are struggling with these babies. They need some help. Chloe Childress and Catherine Ferruzzo, 2 of the counselors that died in this flood, both expressed concern to their parents in the weeks leading up to camp that they were worried. They had some anxiety about having the littlest campers and not having 3 counselors. There was actually conversations that they had with their folks about, gosh, this is going to be a lot of work. I'm scared. I'm nervous about being alone. And I know many of you, or all of you probably, are parents, and my kids are college age. That 1 year, I mean, you know this, right? That 1 year away from home makes such a huge difference, right? The development and growth between a high school graduate and a freshman in college that comes home that next summer is a tremendous amount of development, which makes sense about how they always did it that way, where there was a senior counselor with an ed, but not last year, unfortunately. Every single person that I've spoken with that are former counselors, current counselors, there was never any real training. There were never drills, no drills of any kind. And you've solved that with some legislation that you passed last year. But it's something to really keep an eye on in terms of what you guys are looking to do, because there was just not a single person that said they were given any information about. And you look at what we do in schools and have been doing for years with tornado drills and fire drills and active shooter drills. I mean, that's just unthinkable that these girls would have no training. And again, just the real lack of equipment, no radios, no walkie-talkies, no phones, which we can agree is, that they needed radios. No toolkits, no ladders, no life jackets, no real tools to accomplish any kind of emergency preparedness. So there was some things in the counselor binders that reflect that in the past there were 3 counselors. This information is in the counselor binders. It says for floods, stay in your cabins. You will be informed of proper procedures over the PA system. When in doubt, get help. And then it says at least 1 counselor should be in the cabin at all times. There was no way for counselors to comply with these rules if there was only 2 counselors in a cabin, because very often 1 counselor was on her night off, 1 counselor was alone with the cabin. And so I had counselors describe to me, if a girl had thrown up at 2 o'clock in the morning, I can't send another 8-year-old to the infirmary at 2 o'clock in the morning. I can't leave to go get help. I have no radio. So even the simplest things require 3 counselors, right? Even the simplest things. Even a child that's, and there were some, I heard stories about girls that were inconsolable about, seemingly small things, right? But if you have an inconsolable camper and you need help, if your co-counselor's on her night off, you really are kind of stuck with limited options. And leaving a group of 8-year-olds in the middle of the night to get help is difficult. This is another indication that there was a trend towards having 3 in the fire drill. This is in the binder. In the fire drills, 1 counselor should be in front of the cabin as they go to the muster site, and 2 behind. And of course, that makes perfect sense. That's good advice. That is how we make sure that we've rounded up 12, 13, 14, 15 little girls, right? 1 in front, everybody in line, 2 behind, we've accounted for everybody. Buddy system, whatever. But of course, that requires 3. And again, many of these cabins, all of the younger cabins had only 2 eds. So let's talk a little bit about what they were given in the emergency plan that was provided to counselors. In the case of flood, all campers on Senior Hill must stay in their cabins. And we talked about Senior Hill when we were at the site, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. The reason why Senior Hill seems to have its own part of this paragraph is that Senior Hill was often the area of camp that was cut off from the dining services and the front office, because that land bridge where Cypress Creek and Edmondson Creek converge into the Guadalupe would often have too much water over it for them to safely walk over for meals, right? So Senior Hill must stay in their cabins. They will be given instructions through the loudspeaker, the PA system that we've talked about. If the electricity is off, a walkie-talkie will be used. Part of the problem with that is that they did not have a walkie-talkie. They had a walkie-talkie locked in the riflery range cabinet. Food and other supplies will be delivered to Senior Hill by boat or truck. Campers and counselors never wander away from your cabin. Those on the flats, so now we have this one line about the flats portion, must also stay in their cabins unless told otherwise by the office. All cabins are constructed on high, safe locations. Regarding training for last year, in the orientation for last year,
I remembered at our orientation they talked about like the flood protocol and like what you do for it, and like how it's like there's a part in our bind, like a page in our binder that like has instructions for if anything were ever to happen like this. And whenever they were going over it, it's like not funny, but they were like, oh, like yeah, but like that's not gonna happen. And I like remember them being like, oh, that's never gonna happen.
and that's not the only counselor that indicated that to me, that there was sort of a, don't worry, that's not going to happen. So I do want to talk a little bit about what you guys are obviously very familiar with now, is the relevant portion of the Texas Administrative Code regarding what was required last year. I know you guys made some important changes to that code, but we're talking about what happened last year, and this is the code as it was last year. A written plan of procedures shall be formulated and posted in each permanent and semi-permanent occupied building. So plans shall be written and posted in all buildings. They did have that one-page plan, and it was posted in buildings. The plan must cover 4 areas: disaster, serious accident, epidemic, or fatality. As you'll see when we get to one of the next slides, their emergency plan covered disaster and serious accident, but failed to cover epidemics and fatalities as required by the Administrative Code. The plan shall include procedures for emergency shelter and for evacuation of each occupied building. And so right here, I want to point out that sheltering in place is a plan. That is a fair statement. Sheltering in place is the right thing to do under certain circumstances. We can all agree on that. Until it's not, right? And that's why the law requires also a plan for evacuation of each occupied building. So there was a shelter-in-place plan. There was not an evacuation plan for when sheltering in place was no longer viable. Campers shall be instructed as to their actions in the event of fire, disaster, or the need to evacuate. So camper, and I would put counselors in that category, but the law does say campers, last year should have, at all these camps, at all camps all over the state of Texas, campers should have been drilling. The law required campers at all camps to be instructed as to their actions in the event of fire, disaster, and the need to evacuate. This is not, something that's new to people. I was doing tornado drills in 1970. Campers shall be instructed on their actions. Specific assignments must be made to each staff member and counselor. This is so critical, right? People need to know what to do. It can't be one person who holds everything in their brain. Campers and counselors, and staff have to have specific assignments to know what to do in the event of a fire, to know what to do in the event of a flood, to know what to do if an entire cabin gets the flu. Documentation of this training shall be kept at the camp's administrative on-site office or location. So, plan has to be posted in every building, but proof of the training of counselors, staff members, and campers shall be kept at the camp's administrative on-site office. So this is the one-page sheet that you guys have all seen. This is the emergency instructions plan. This is the one that the inspector verified was posted in every occupied building. So that portion of the administrative code was complied with. The plan was written and it was posted. The plan should address disasters, accidents, epidemics, and fatalities. This plan covers the two that I mentioned. The plan should address emergency shelter and evacuation, does not address evacuation. Campers were not instructed. No specific assignments were given to staff or counselors, and no documentation of training because inadequate training was given. All right, so June 29th, 2025, 557 campers arrive at Camp Mystic. 386 of them arrived to attend the second session on the Guadalupe River campus. This is a picture of Missy Peck and her little girl Lulu Peck, and standing next to them is Catherine Ferruzzo and Chloe Childress. In the second picture, it's Chloe and Catherine greeting Lulu Peck. The reason why Missy Peck is outside of her car, because that's not exactly how the procedure was supposed to go. You drive up and your camper hops out, or they take the bus from the town that you live in. But Missy was concerned about Lulu because Lulu was anxious. This was her first time to go to camp. This was their first child to go to camp. And so Missy really wanted to encourage Lulu to not be scared, and there are Catherine and Chloe doing the same thing. What's important about this drop-off procedure is that Dick had a good eye for parents that were anxious and children that were anxious. And he would come over to them and say, I got your girl. She's safe here. She's safe with us. Mystic is the safest place on earth. I had multiple parents tell me, you'll hear from a father of a girl that survived who had some anxiety of his own. He had begun having nightmares 2 weeks before sending his daughter to camp, and all of the nightmares involved water. And so he got out of his car to comfort his child and to give her some instructions about swimming in the river. And Dick came over and said much the same thing. And again, that's because he was the patriarch of the camp. He comforted these families and these children. Moving forward in our timeline, we're now to July 2nd. This was the day that a representative inspector from Dishes came to the camp property to do an inspection, an annual inspection. This is done every year. The inspections are done during camp, operating camp season. The Dishes inspector has a checklist. We have that whole checklist if you want to look at it. It's important to note that this inspector, and most of these inspectors at the time last year, she was a sanitation specialist. Her expertise was, food safety and that type of thing. She was. I definitely want to be fair to her. She had a checklist and a job to do. She was not a safety consultant. She was not a safety expert. She was not a risk assessment person. She was a sanitation officer that basically checked for, did you do background checks on your employees? Check. Did everybody do the youth protection against sexual molestation? Check. Do you have those tests? Check. Do you have a plan? Check. Is it posted in every building? Yes. Right? And then the plan gets sent to Dishes to another person to evaluate. So it wasn't her job out there on site to evaluate the efficacy of their safety plan. She, was measuring food temperature. One of the big, we interviewed her. She was very cooperative, and she said one of the biggest problems that camps have is food poisoning. Right, and food issues, and so they really want to make sure that the kitchen and the food is safe. But you will notice that in their inspection report, is there a written plan that addresses the 4 areas? Yes. That's not quite right. Are all camp and volunteers made aware of the plan to be implemented during the staff training program? Yes, I believe they are made aware of the plan, but they're not trained in it. Is there documentation of training? Yes, and I think that's probably no, because there is no real training. July 2nd to the 4th, TDEM starts to get involved in getting information out about upcoming weather. On July 2nd, on their website, TDEM activates state emergency response resources. This is a little bit broader, right, because it's just July 2nd. They're just kind of at this point figuring out what's happening with the weather. It's not super specific to Kerr County, but it does involve the Hill Country, but it's the beginning of their warnings, right? We are watching this. Rain and flooding threatens parts of Texas, including the Hill Country. It gives, some warnings. According to the National Weather Service, heavy rainfall with the potential to cause flash flooding. So this is the first sort of alert. That's not quite the right word. The first communication given by TDEM on their website on July 2nd. On July 3rd, you'll notice we're now like in all caps, right? We're a little bit more urgent. We've increased our readiness. We know a little bit more about what's coming here. We're ramping this up a little bit. Texas responders remain ready to support local officials as flooding threatens the state over the next couple of days. Texans are urged to keep personal preparedness as their #1 priority. The National Weather Service states heavy rainfall and flash flooding will continue to threaten the Hill.
Ms. Garrett, could you please continue to speak into the microphone so those online can hear your remarks?
You bet. Thank you
ma'am.
for the
Appreciate it.
reminder. I have a tendency to wander. Thank you. Heavy rainfall and flash flooding will continue to threaten the Hill Country over the next couple of days. Again, just an increased communication by TDEM of what's coming. And on July 3rd, TDEM hosted, as usual, their daily 8 a.m. daily weather call. But they had an additional call at 10 a.m., which was a statewide weather call as well, with the National Weather Service. In a somewhat unusual interest level, 468 entities did dial in to the Zoom call. At 11:37 a.m., the National Weather Service predicts greater severity. TDEM deploys resources. We're talking about, national, as you all well know, National Guard resources, state resources, to 160 square miles. By 1 p.m., resources are fully deployed. And at 1:18 p.m., the National Weather Service issues a flood watch. The relevant language in the flood watch is, do you have to get a little closer for 1 second? Sorry. Excessive runoff may result in flooding of rivers, creeks, streams, and other low-lying and flood-prone locations. Monitor forecasts, be alert for possible flood warnings. Those living in areas prone to flooding should be prepared to take action should flooding develop. So obviously, a watch is not as urgent as a warning, but at 1:18 p.m. on July 3rd, there is actually a flood watch issued by the National Weather Service. One thing that's important to note here that we learned in the testimony from last summer is that people responded differently to these messages from TDEM. You had Kendall County testify last year that their emergency management coordinator took action. This was noted by him. He called people in his community, he called RV parks and campgrounds, started notifying people, contacted camps, went to bed uneasy and on alert and ready. Okay. Unfortunately, in Kerr County, it was a little bit different of a response. You had most of the county officials either on vacation without a delegate in their place or sick and asleep. So you just had different responses to the same information. You also had different responses to the same information by some of the local camps. You had, the director at Mo Ranch interviewed with me, which I appreciated, and he helped me understand some of the things that they were doing, which was very different. They were aware of a lot of this information. They were on alert, and then you had other camps that were unaware. We know from testimony in the court hearings that the TDEM information was not accessed, as far as we know, based on testimony by the Eastlands. So now we're moving to the timeline regarding July 3rd and July 4th. As I said, everybody responded a little bit differently. Everybody related to Mystic told me that it was kind of business as usual on the evening of July 3rd. It wasn't really raining. It had been rainy, but nobody was on high alert at this point. They went to dinner. They had Vespers, which is a church service, normally held on a Sunday, but it was held on a Thursday for that week. And then they went to Rec Hall where they had counselor skits. So everything was being sort of treated as a normal evening at Camp Mystic on the evening of July 3rd. After counselor skits at approximately 9:45 p.m., Glenn Yankee arrives for his 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. shift. I think it should be noted that we were told that after 2 a.m., there was no adult awake necessarily on the campus of Camp Mystic as security. Glenn Yankee and Lee Poole's shift was from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. each night. One family member that I believe is present here told us that she was concerned about camp security before they sent their eldest daughter. She called to ask about security and was told that an ex-Marine patrols the camp 24/7. And that was not, obviously a true statement. Glenn Yankee and Lee Poole patrolled from 10 to 2. At 10 a.m., it was go to your cabins, get cleaned up, get ready for bed, go to bed, lights out, and it's their tradition to play taps on the loudspeaker, the PA system that we've been referencing, at 10 p.m. (12:45) in our timeline, counselors who'd had the night off that had gone into Kerrville for their night off arrived back at camp. They report dangerous conditions, water on the roads, to Francis Blackwell Loper, the gatekeeper, and they also report that to the Big Three when they turn in their cell phones. They're told that if they had felt unsafe, they could have stayed in Kerrville. But thank goodness they didn't, because they were needed at camp. Counselors in that group told me that one of the counselors was a local girl and had indicated, and so had some knowledge of driving in the rainy season, and she was alarmed at the rain that evening when they got home at 12:45 a.m. At 1:14 a.m., obviously the much talked about National Weather Service flash flood warning comes in. The flash flood warning, of course, is a whole different ballgame than the flash flood watch. It's a lot stronger language. Life-threatening flash flooding. Thunderstorms producing flash flooding. Again, life-threatening flash flooding of creeks and streams. Some locations that will experience flash flooding include Kerrville, Ingram, Hunt. It's a very strongly worded flash flood warning given at 1:14 a.m. A lot of folks that I have spoken with talk about alert fatigue. I've spoken to many people that live in the area, local homeowners, and then, of course, other witnesses talk about ignoring warnings and ignoring alerts. I think you've addressed that in some of the legislation from last summer. But to be clear, people received the alert. And one thing I want to point out about alert fatigue is that one of the Eastland's lawyers provided us with some data that in the last 25 years, there have been 91 flash flood warnings in 25 years. We did some 91. We did some of our own research. I want to be clear that it was not a deep dive, but we did some pretty good research on how many of those flash flood warnings were during camp season, and we could only find 3 since 2009 of those potentially 91 were during camp season. Counselor who had a disabled phone received the flash. They were allowed to bring disabled phones to camp for music. She received the alert on her disabled phone. A counselor who was spending her night off in Bird, which I showed you on our site tour, which is the counselor lounge, she received the flash flood warning. A member of the Big Three received the flash flood warning. Glenn Yankee received it and noted that he and Dick had discussed it. Dick's phone data that we were given shows that he went to the National Weather Service website shortly after the alert. He was really, as you'll see in a moment, very obsessively checking weather apps and weather services, including the National Weather Service. Code Red called Edward Eastland's phone, and he also received the text alert for the flash flood warning at 1:51 a.m.
An old phone that I was using as an iPod that night, and so I had my iPod and like the flash flood warning still went through on it, because I guess like they do even if you don't have Wi-Fi or like service or anything. So I guess those still go through, and I got that.
Again, 151. This is the Code Red weather warning sent to Edward Eastland's phone. The National Weather Service has issued a flash flood warning for your Highway 39 location from 1:14 a.m. July 4 until 4:15 a.m. July 4. That was read, as Edward also told us, at approximately 1:51 a.m. This is a prophetic statement, a quote from Dick Eastland from 1990. I'm sure there will be other drownings. People don't heed the warnings. We received some phone data, as I mentioned. Dick was monitoring the weather pretty much all night. This portion of his phone records, our cell phone expert tells us, this is where he's actually launching weather apps. Okay, so actually physically launching some type of weather app. And you'll see that he was actively monitoring AccuRite, National Weather Service, NOAA, and other radar and weather apps. We have countless pages of the updates that he was receiving on his phone, hundreds of pages of the radar updates between 12:42 and 3:23. All right, so now we're getting into the critical timeline. At 1:45 a.m., Dick Eastland summons Edward Eastland to the front office. Now, Dick has been at the front office. Pretty much everybody else, for the most part, except for Glenn Yankee, the night watchman, went to bed as normal that evening. But Dick was apparently worried about the weather. He stayed up. We're not sure exactly what time he made his way from his home with Mrs. Eastland to the front office, but he was monitoring the weather from the front office, and he radios at 1:45 a.m. to Edward Eastland, who's asleep in bed, but they have a radio in their room. We've gotten 2 inches of rain in the last hour. We need to get the ground crew to move waterfront equipment. Edward tells us he called the grounds crew right after he called me. So at 1:45, Dick is now concerned that there's going to be a rise in the river. When we did our walkthrough, they showed us that the canoes are on a rack, kind of closer down to the waterfront where you saw. And when the river begins to rise, it's not uncommon for them to move that equipment higher up in case there's any rise in the river. I'm told by local homeowners that is a common thing to do anytime there is a rise in the river, especially over July 4th, where people had a lot of equipment down and near the water. It's common to move property. Obviously, moving property is one of the first alerts that the water might rise. So it's important to know in terms of staffing, the only non-counselor adults on the flats, and obviously the counselors at 18 would be considered an adult, but I'm making the distinction that the only non-counselor adults on the flats in the early morning hours of July 4th were Dick Eastland, Edward Eastland, and Glenn Yankee. Glenn tells us that at some point, 1:30, 1:45, his shift's obviously going to end at 2. Dick Eastland tells him to go home, that he doesn't want him basically to get trapped at the camp if the low water crossings flood. Thankfully, Glenn says, no, I'm not going to go home. I think I should stay here. And it's a good thing he did, because they needed as much help as they could get. 1:47 a.m., Edward says, he gets radioed at 1:45. He basically gets up and immediately leaves his home. As you know from our tour, this is called Ranch House. This is where Edward and Mary Liz were living at the time last year. He gets in his truck. He goes down that little road that you saw that turns onto that road right in front of the front office. It's a very short distance. He did have to cross over Edmondson Creek, got Bubblegum Creek right here. He crossed over that little turn and went to the front office, and he tells us, as I was going, there was maybe an inch of water on the bridge right here. So he is able to make his way over to the flats side of the campus. At 2:01 a.m., Edward texts a video to Mary Liz, and on the video he says, I'm not coming home tonight to my wife. Mary Liz responds, I knew that would happen. There's a bed in Bird. So basically what we're talking about here, and I'll show you a video here in a second, is as you were there, that Bubblegum Creek, he sent her a video. It had gotten too high to cross, okay? And she says, well, she obviously realizes he's going to be sleeping on the flat side that night, so there's a bed in the Bird Lounge, she tells him. At 2:11 a.m., Glenn Yankee notifies retired Fire Chief Stephen Hayes about the flooding. He says, you wouldn't believe the flooding here. Wish I could get a photo of the creek by the golf course. At 2:14 a.m., Glenn Yankee takes a video of Bubblegum Creek, similar to Edward, to document the flooding. The picture on the right we took on one of our site visits, and we all stood there last week, and you saw how little water is in Bubblegum Creek. But on the night at 2:14 on this video from Glenn Yankee, you can see, if you look towards the background, how high the creek is. Also at 2:14, a photograph is taken by Edward Eastland and texted to his wife, Mary Liz. This is Dick Eastland, and these are 9 men in the garage, which we pointed out to you on our tour, and I'll show you again on the map. After moving, they retreated back over to the garage after moving the canoes and kayaks. This is the grounds crew that I've told you about. The reason those videos are important of Bubblegum Creek is that, as we have pointed out already, once Bubblegum Creek became impassable, the flats was isolated from Senior Hill and from the homes and from Cypress Lake, okay? So effectively at this point, whatever adults are on the flats side are the only adults that are going to be on the flats side for the rest of that night, because it was impassable by 2:14 a.m. At 2:30 a.m., critical to our timeline, 2 counselors run to the front office from Bug House Cabin, which is the cabin closest to the river, and one from Look-In. They had come, and you saw how close those cabins were. They had both come out onto their porches, concerned because each cabin was taking in a little bit of water. And so they consulted with one another, and they decided to run to the front office. Now, let me remind you, this is 2:30 a.m. It is pitch black. It is pouring rain. These girls are in their pajamas, and they make the decision to run to the front office. And so that was a significant decision. They were obviously very concerned about what was going on. And so they run to the front office, down the road, into the front office to ask for assistance and to tell Dick and Edward that water was coming into their cabins. At 2:33 a.m., Dick texts his wife, "So far, over 4 inches, bubblegum creek up, stay put, I am at the office."
That can be a real serious problem.
That's where our meteorologist said if you get 3 or 4 inches, that could be a real serious problem. And Dick obviously knows this is a real serious problem because he's texting that there's over 4 inches of rain. We know from cell phone data that at 2:37 a.m., Dick's phone connects to his Tahoe as he drives the counselors back to their cabins. These are the 2 counselors that come from Bug House and look in. They go into their cabins. They determine that the water is coming in to the cabin from the hill. It's water that is sheeting off from the hill into, and you saw how that cabin is sort of built into the hill, and water was coming into the cabins. Dick and Edward assess the water in the cabins. They tell them to put down towels and to stay put, that they'll come back and check on them. At 2:42, Dick's phone connects to his Tahoe as he drives back to the front office. Now things are starting to ramp up a little bit because at 2:55 a.m., Frances Blackwell Loper, who is in the gatehouse is living quarters. It's a bedroom, a sitting room, and a little kitchen. She has gone to bed. She wakes up in the middle of the night and puts her feet down in quite a bit of water. And things go south very fast for Frances. I mean, the water rises very quickly. She gets on the radio and frantically radios to Edward and to whoever's listening, "My cabin is flooding." Edward says, "Get to higher ground, get out, Frances, get to higher ground." And then Frances's walkie-talkie goes dead. And they spend a few minutes trying to raise Frances on the walkie-talkie, which they cannot do. There are also phone records indicating that they tried to call her. And so things are much more serious now that they know that Frances Blackwell's cabin has filled with water. And you remember I pointed out to you on our site visit, the gatehouse and Bug House, right, are, kind of on that same linear distance, so to speak, from the Guadalupe River. So now things have gotten a lot more high alert. Dick radios, "We need to start getting the girls out of Bug House," as he had been checking the waterfront. He had been walking around. He radios, "We need to get the girls out of Bug House." Edward tells us that approximately 3 a.m. or shortly after when they start that process, the road leading down to that end cabin was completely dry, and the soccer field, which is that grass field right in front of all of those cabins that you saw, had not taken on water yet. At 3:10 a.m., Tweety Eastland texts her husband Dick, "Our house is flooded." So, of course, he's getting in information from multiple sources. Frances Blackwell has frantically radioed. He already knows from the counselors the water has started coming in. Now Mrs. Eastland has said our house is flooded. So he begins what we are describing as the 3 evacuation attempts made by Dick, Edward, and Glenn. The first evacuation attempt, we believe, based on our timestamps, started approximately 3:10, 3:11. The first 3 cabins in order are Bug House, Look In, and Hangout. Again, this is the area where the cabins are located. You've got Bug House. You can see the water line on Bug House. That cabin was completely filled with water. Look In, completely filled with water. Hangout. The water line is not as high on Hangout. Those are the first 3 cabins closest to the Guadalupe River. Dick gets in his Tahoe, Edward gets in his truck, and Glenn gets in his truck, and the three of them drive from the front office where they had been congregating, and they drive down that road that you and I walked, and they drive all the way down to look in. They go into Bug House, look in, and hang out, and tell all of the girls to come out of their cabins and start getting in their vehicles. It's, according to witnesses that I interviewed, far from orderly. It is girls jumping into the Tahoe, jumping into the bed of the trucks, jumping into the cabs of the trucks, but also girls walking. There are also girls, counselors, that told me that even in that first evacuation attempt, some were walking down the road. Now, again, at that point, it was safe to walk down the road. There was no standing water yet, according to most of the people. So they turn around, the three vehicles, and they drive back to the front office, where the girls get out of the vehicles, and the girls that were walking catch up, and they walk to Rec Hall, where that little building, where that little arrow ends, that's Rec Hall, which of course you saw. This is a photograph taken from Cozy Cabin by one of the big three, or one of the photographers, time-stamped 3:23 a.m. You can see that these are the girls walking from the front office to Rec Hall, which is a very short distance. You can see that there's really no standing water on the grassy portion. There obviously begins to be a little bit of pooling water here as they get closer to Cozy Cabin. Evacuation attempt number 2. So they're going to just repeat what they just did to get Bug House, look in, and hangout out. And now they're driving their 3 vehicles down to Tumble Inn 1 and 2. As you saw when we were out there, that is 2 cabins, but 1 big cabin, okay? Jumble House. They drive exactly the same way that they did for the first evacuation attempt. They stop in front of Tumble Inn 1 and 2. The water's starting to get a little bit higher at this point. It's starting to come up on the wheel well, according to witnesses. Again, it's a, get in the car, it's madness, it's mayhem, it's jumping into cars and trucks, and again, it's some campers and counselors walking. As they are retreating from evacuation attempt number 2, the water's higher. Edward describes to us that there are now canoes and kayaks floating. He had to get out to move some debris out of his way as they were driving back to the front office for the second time. As they were moving past Jumble House, the counselors were out on the porch and they screamed to Edward, "Should we just walk?" And he said, "Yes, walk." So Jumble House, the reason they're in blue, is that they walked to Rec Hall. They did not get into vehicles. They began walking to Rec Hall. One of the famous photos that's been widely circulated, it's timestamped 3:26 a.m. These are some of the girls from Tumble and Jumble walking into Rec Hall at 3:26 a.m. Edward recalls to us the water at that point on the road was maybe ankle deep. I remember some of the canoes and kayaks were floating. At this point, the water was an all-time record. It had never gotten that high in history. It felt surreal. This can't be happening. This water had never touched these cabins. It had never been on the grass of the soccer field. You wish it was a dream. It was wild. Again, Jumble House counselors, should we walk? Yes. And they do begin to walk. The unfortunate thing about the haphazard nature of getting the girls to walk from Jumble House on their own, and the unfortunate circumstance that counselors were not trained in how to move a group of 10-year-old girls from one point to another in rain and water. There was no system, and this is not the fault of the counselors at all, but there was no system for getting those girls from Jumble House to Rec Hall. And we're not totally clear exactly who went where, but the counselors for Jumble House did not end up in Rec Hall. They ended up in Cozy Cabin. And unfortunately, that is when little Greta Toronzo decided that she needed to backtrack to get her sheet. And as she backtracked, she got away from the group, and one of the little campers told me, I saw her, and then I didn't. Evacuation attempt number 3, Nut Hut, Chatterbox, and Gigglebox. At this point, the water again is rising. Glenn Yankee knows there's no more driving in this. He tells Dick Eastland, we can't drive in this. He says he's not sure if Dick hears him. We know that Dick Eastland doesn't really need to be told that. Dick Eastland knows how dangerous it is to drive in this rising water. Because Glenn knows there's no more driving in this, he parks his car down by Birdhouse and gets out of his car on foot to assist the evacuation on foot. There was a comment made about him protecting his truck. I don't think that's fair. He parked where he could park safely, and he got out on foot to continue to help evacuate people. For reasons unknown to us, knowing he should, yes? The Chatterbox timeline, yes, is 3:20. The reason we're using that timestamp is because Jumble House was walking into Rec Hall between 3:23 and 3:26. Okay. Again, these are approximate. We're piecing them together as best we can from all of the records, but that's about what we think is going on at this point. So we don't know why Dick continued to drive in this level of water. But we do know that he drives back down on the third attempt and parks his vehicle on that little side road that you saw that is extremely close to the entrance, the porch and the entrance to Bubble Inn. He parks right here. Edward gets as far as he can and parks right here. Glenn parks his truck by Birdhouse. Birdhouse. Glenn and Edward walk towards Gigglebox, and they converge at Gigglebox, and Glenn assists the counselors and campers in Gigglebox to walk over to Cricket's Corner. I'll show you that path in 1 second. At the same time that Glenn is helping Gigglebox get across that road to Cricket's Corner, remember that little small pavilion that you saw, and he tells those girls, if the water continues to rise here at Cricket Corner, go up the hill, which is ultimately what happens. The water does continue to rise, and they do go up that portion of the hill. I'll show you their path in 1 second. But meanwhile, while that's going on, the counselors in Nut Hut and Chatterbox, they express to us that they know nobody's coming. Nobody's coming for us. We know that that's done. The driving around is over. These counselors realize we've got to take action. And that's what they do. The counselors in Nut Hut and Chatterbox go out the back of their cabins onto the hillside to evacuate their girls up the hill. Now, I want to be clear about the way they described what was going on here. It was, again, pitch black, sheeting rain, aggressive lightning. Every single person that describes this night to us talks about the aggressive lightning strikes and thunder. There is now water rushing behind those cabins. They all describe water is rushing behind those cabins, and so they are taking the girls out of windows, passing a girl through the window to one counselor. The counselor basically piggybacks or assists them across the water rushing behind the cabins, gets them up on the hill, goes back for another camper, back and forth until they get all the girls out of Nut Hut and Chatterbox, and the counselors too. Now, heroic actions on the part of these counselors, okay? But also not a safe evacuation plan. We heard stories about 3 little girls getting completely separated on that hill from their counselors. And thank God they hung onto a tree, the 3 of them, and a counselor came back down and was able to find them. But that was a harrowing process. That we also heard descriptions of campers trying to get over that rushing water behind the cabins to get onto the hill, losing the hand of their counselor and getting swept down, but thankfully grabbed and brought back. So this was heroic, no question about it. I mean, and they needed to get to higher ground, but it wasn't a plan. It wasn't a safe plan. It was an option that was taken that, thank God, nobody died. But it was very ad hoc. All right, and then I mentioned that while those girls are getting their campers out and onto the hill, Gigglebox is being escorted over to Crickett's Corner. That's the blue line. They go up halfway up the hill. They stay halfway up the hill, the steep, rocky hillside for 2 hours until the water goes down. Nut Hut and Chatterbox actually go all the way up to Sky High, where there's a pavilion up there that they hunker down under the pavilion for 2 hours. The reason why the girls from Gigglebox stay in the middle of the mountain is they couldn't really access. There's like, when you go back there, you can see that there's sort of a bluff little area that they couldn't have gotten past. At this point, obviously, things getting really, really serious. Dick radios frantically, we have to get Bubble and Twins out. We have to get Bubble and Twins out. He has, remember, parked his car right next to the entrance of Bubble. That's Bubble Inn. That's where Dick was parked. These are the occupants of Bubble Inn. Every single person in this photograph died in the river that evening. Chloe Childress, Margaret Bellows, Lila Bonner, Molly DeWitt, Ellen Getton, Janie Hunt, Lainey Landry, Catherine Ferruzzo, Sarah Marsh, Lenny McCowan, Wynn Naylor, Eloise Peck, Abby Pohl, Renee Smeistrela, Mary Barrett Stevens. Every one of these children died in the river that night. That's the water line that got to Bubble Inn. The reason why that is really significant is that, as you can see from the interior of Bubble Inn, that it was a flat ceiling. They were either going to drown in Bubble Inn or in the river. So Dick obviously knew that he had to get them out of the cabin. We know so little about Bubble Inn because we weren't able to interview any survivors, and we weren't able to interview any parents of survivors. And so there's a lot of mystery that surrounds Bubble Inn that we just don't, at this point, have answers to. What I can say is what we know from the radio transmissions. Dick starts with, we need to get Twins and Bubble out, okay? And then the next radio transmission from Dick is, I have Bubble Inn cabin in my car. I'm stuck against a tree. I need help. Edward, Dad, I'm sorry. I can't get to you. I'm staying here with Twins. Britt Eastland hears all of these radio transmissions from Cypress Lake campus. And what we know from those radio transmissions, or one hypothesis is that Dick put all of those girls into the Tahoe, and the Tahoe began to float away and ultimately surge down the river and crash. That's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that he was in the process of loading them all into the car, and some of them could have been swept away the way Greta Toronzo was swept away. Again, that's a mystery. We do know that Dick Eastland loved every little girl that came to Camp Mystic. He was a loving man, and I can't believe that he was sitting in the driver's seat of that car with, little girls untended to. So those are some of the mysteries that surround Bubble Inn. What we do know is that Dick's Tahoe crashed into a tree a couple of 100 yards downriver from Bug House. What we also know is that Renee Smeistrela, Janie Hunt, and Mary Barrett Stevens were found in the vehicle dead with Dick Eastland. All of the other girls and counselors were recovered downriver. Wiggle Inn. After Glenn assisted the girls from Gigglebox over to Crickett's Corner so that they could safely go up the hill, he then makes his way to Wiggle Inn. At Wiggle Inn, when he arrived there, all of the campers and counselors were on the porch, frantically trying to figure out what to do. Glenn recognizes we have limited options here. He can't send these girls out into the water at the level it was at this point. Going to Rec Hall is no longer an option. Sheltering in place is really the only option. He determines, rightfully I'm sure, that it's no longer an option to move them across the road the way he did Gigglebox. I'm sure that was probably his intention. That was no longer an option because of the level of the water. It was not an option to go to Rec Hall. The only option left to them was to shelter in place, which they did. While they were in the cabin, you can see right here, that is Glenn's truck that had been washed from its place near Birdhouse down the road and basically kind of crashes into that telephone pole that's right across from Wiggle Inn. His hazard lights are going off that whole time, which they all sort of described as helpful because it was some amount of light other than the lightning. The counselor, one of the first counselors that was willing to talk to me, and I'd like to give her some credit for that. She was very brave because these girls are deeply, deeply traumatized. But she talked to me, and when Glenn ushered all of those girls back into Wiggle Inn, knowing that was their only option, she wasn't about to go back in that cabin. So she stood on this windowsill. The water is clear up here. She put her feet on that windowsill, stood in that window, holding on to the roof eave for 2 hours. She helped Glenn move trunks out of that window. He would push trunks through that window to try to get the debris. The trunks, everybody described the trunks as a real hazard, okay? And so getting them out of the cabin was one of his first tasks. Glenn did a walkthrough with us. There's no question that he comforted those girls. There's no question that he was guarding those girls. He describes a really interesting phenomenon that was obviously going on with the water just going in such sort of bizarre directions. He describes being in Wiggle Inn and trying to set himself up at a place based on the water flow that would keep a girl from rushing past him and out a window. And he said that suddenly the water direction changed, and he said I had to shift all the girls and myself a different direction to keep that sort of, him as a barrier. So that was some interesting insight. The reason why the girls and Glenn and the counselors in Wiggle Inn survived is that Wiggle Inn had vaulted ceilings. Unlike Twins 1 and 2 and Bubble Inn, Wiggle had vaulted ceilings and water, and they needed it. They needed that. Excuse me. I'm so sorry. They needed that extra space that the vaulted ceilings provided them. And they described that the water was rising and rising and rising, and then it just stopped. And a lot of people describe it that way. It just suddenly stopped and began to recede. So that's what was happening in Wiggle Inn. Now we move to Twins 1 and 2. So you remember that Edward briefly stopped at Gigglebox, saw that Glenn was handling Gigglebox, and he starts, and again, he did a walkthrough with us, which we really appreciated. He starts wading, if you remember, that little grassy area between Giggle and walking towards Bubble and Twins. He starts wading through that area in thigh-high to waist-high water, making his way to the porch of Twins 1 and 2. We have a broader circle here because here are the Twins 1 and 2 cabins. Right out, you guys and I were standing right on the edge of that porch right there when we noted the PA system that was between the tennis courts and the Twins cabins. This building right here is important. It's the commissary building, and on top of the commissary building is Polar Palace, where some of the Polish kitchen workers were staying. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail in a second, but it does relate to Twins 1. So Edward makes his way to those cabins. You look at the water line, significant. The water line is there, you can see that with the flat ceiling in Twins 1 and 2, the water completely filled the cabin. At 3:26, this is video taken from Polar Palace, taken by some of the Polish kitchen workers, who again are college-age girls. In the distance is Rec Hall, right? This is the same time, 3:26 a.m., as you see girls walking to Rec Hall. If you focus in the back of the video, you'll see those same girls walking into Rec Hall. You'll notice that the power is still on, lights are still on, and you'll get a feel for what was going on in Twins 1 and 2. .350, you can see activity inside of Twins. You can see the lights are on. You have to study it, but you can see, I think you can see possibly Edward and or counselors. They're trying to figure out what's going on. We know from Edward's iPhone data that at 4:09 a.m. he is submerged underwater. But what happens is that he walks to that porch that we were standing on. He gets through the water to that first porch. One of the counselors from Twins 1 comes out onto the porch to talk to him, leaving the 17-year-old counselor alone in Twins 1 with her girls. The counselor that came out and Edward cannot open the door at that point to Twins 1. They cannot get back into Twins 1. They both describe trying really hard to get back into Twins 1. They can't, so they walk down that little porch and go into Twins 2, where there are two Ets in there with their campers. There are vents between in the adjoining wall. They begin to talk to the 17-year-old counselor through the vents, trying to give her some guidance, telling her what to do. Edward describes, frantically looking for options. He's trying to figure out how to get a vent out of the ceiling. There's no tools. He's looking around for options. They're trying to figure out what to do. Again, the problem that they had that Glenn didn't have was the flat ceilings. They know that they're running out of options sooner than was happening in cabins that had vaulted ceilings. And so we know from statements and from Edward that the 17-year-old counselor made the critical decision, because it did save some girls, to start getting them out of the cabin. They were just running out of airspace. One parent of a survivor said her daughter described having her chin, inches from the ceiling. And so there was only one option, and it was for those girls to get out of that cabin. And so the little counselor starts moving them out of the cabin. Apparently, something in the pressure changed because the accounts described that she was getting them out of the door of that and was able to open the door. They described having to push the girls under the water to get out of the door and back above the water. Mary Grace Baker drowned in the river. Lucy Dillon drowned inside Twins 1. She was found inside Twins 1 the next day. Mary Kate Jacoby drowned in the river. Hannah Lawrence, who's a twin, drowned in the river. Kellyanne Lytle, Blakely McCrory, they all drowned in the river. The other girls that I have labeled Bug House Tree, which are 4 girls. As I showed you at the site visit, there was that little grove of trees right past the bug house cabin, and because of the direction of the water at whatever point, these girls were thrust into that direction. And, you know, it's not obviously like some cartoon where they just landed in the tree. No, they were grasping at limbs. They were grasping and trying to get into this grove of trees to safety. And these 4 little girls were able to do that, along with the 17-year-old counselor that was with them. They all ended up in the bug house tree. This little girl right here, where I have clung to column, she was thrust also in that same direction, but landed a little earlier at Tumble Inn, we believe. We believe she was at Tumble Inn on one of those limestone columns. She was able to grab on to one of those limestone columns, and as the water continued to rush violently past her, she clung to that column and moved up, said she was neck high in water, and clung to like a little, just clung to that column for 2 hours and lived. This little girl right here, I'm going to bookmark her. She and another little girl from Twins 2 were found alive down the river, and I'll tell you that story in 1 second. This is the Twins 2 cabin photo. Hadley Hannah died in the river. Virginia Hollis made it to the bug house tree, but couldn't hold on. She dropped out of the tree and died in the river. Rebecca Lawrence, twin to Hannah, died in the river. Margaret Sheedy and Seal Stewart all died in the river. And as you know, Seal Stewart's remains have still not been found. 4 little girls ended up in the bug house tree, and 1 counselor ended up in the bug house tree. The other counselor ended up alone in a different tree. So again, they were all sort of thrust in that, I guess if they got in that one flow, they all got shoved into that bug house tree. This little girl right here and this little girl right here, I'll tell those stories in a minute. They were found alive down the river. This is what we're referring to as the bug house tree, but this is after it has sort of fallen over, after people were rescued from the bug house tree. But you can see this is bug house right here. So just beyond, but up on the hill, is this grove of trees that the three counselors, 8 campers, and then Edward Eastland was also pushed over to the bug house tree and survived along with those other people in the bug house tree. This is just to give you some scale. This was on one of our trips. The bug house tree has been removed because it did fall down. This is where the base of the bug house tree was. So that kind of gives you some perspective about how high the water was. This little girl, oh my goodness. This little girl is alive. She traveled 6.5 miles down the river from Camp Mysticus and was found near Camp La Junta. 6.5 miles that little girl fought with debris, described to her parents that she was submerged multiple times. These parents of these survivors have every single one of them described the most surreal moment when their daughters so calmly told them, "That was the point, Daddy, when I knew I was going to die. I just knew I was going to die." Up and down, submerged and up, under debris, covered in ant bites, this little girl gets thrust upon a debris pile and stays there. Actually, I think falls asleep. You can imagine why. And when the water recedes, 2 young women, 2 sisters that were living in their grandparents' house, come out at daybreak to sort of assess what's going on, and they hear, "Help, help." And they search and search. It takes a while. I mean, this is a debris pile that's out in kind of in the middle of the river, sort of, out in the water. And they can't find her, but they can hear her. And then they describe this little head pops up. This little girl's head pops up, and they get over to the debris pile, and they get this little baby girl off of the debris pile. And they take her actually to the La Junta camp infirmary, and La Junta takes custody of this little girl. These 2 little girls didn't make it to the bug house tree, but they're alive. They were also thrust downriver. They traveled approximately a mile down the river. Also were thrown on, they weren't together, so to speak. I mean, they didn't realize each other was they each got thrust down the river and landed on this big debris pile, some distance apart. This was approximately 4 a.m. We know Edward was submerged at 4:09 and swept off the porch around 4:09. So that's kind of the time frame. So in that 4:09 to 4:19 period of time, they are on a debris pile near the home of the Griffin family. The Griffins, Lori and Grant Griffin, grew up there. They've lived there their whole lives. He's a home builder in that area. Their house was flooding. It was flooding significantly. Their power was out. They were moving things to the second floor. They had their windows open, and the same type of thing happened with them. In the midst of this loud storm, this raging noise from the river, they hear, "Help, help." Again, it's pitch black. It's pouring rain. Storming like crazy. The river is rushing downriver. It's flooding the Griffin's home, and they rush out into the dark of night, Mr. Griffin and his young adult daughter's boyfriend, and they rescue these 2 little girls off of the debris pile.
Out, but then we all fell out of the window, and the water started rushing, and it ran this way. And I went out underwater and almost drowned, and I thought I was gonna die, but then I came
Because then, I couldn't breathe. I just kept going up in the water, but I wasn't breathing because I literally couldn't.
My legs are so sore.
So you guys just grabbed onto a tree and floated down with it?
Well, there was
I had to tread water.
Mine was staying in place, so I was like, okay, I'll just stay on here. But then that was where you guys were, so. I have a bunch of scratches.
Friday, July 4th, 2025, 4:19 and 7 seconds.
Kerr County 911, what's your emergency?
Hello, this is Riley Griffin, and I live at 2551 Highway 39 in Hunt, Texas. And we've got the flood is up to our house right now. We're okay, but we live about a mile down the road from Camp Mystic, and we've already got 2 little girls who have come down the river, and we've gotten to them, but I'm not sure how many else are out there.
Okay. What is your address?
It's 2551 Highway 39.
And you have the girls at your house?
We have we have 2 little girls who have come by the river, and we've been able to grab them, and that's all we've seen so far.
Okay,
But
and what
they
is your
said that
name?
they want Riley Griffin.
And a callback number for you.
I'm sorry.
And your callback number?
83.
Okay, as I mentioned to you earlier, so much is going on in so many of the other areas of the camp while all of this is going on. All of the girls that were initially evacuated in those first 2 attempts, 95 campers and 13 counselors, end up in Rec Hall, which you guys walked into, and you saw that there was a balcony that measures about 5 feet wide that goes across, 3 sides of the building. There is one way to get to the balcony, and that's this staircase, which is this staircase here. There's one area to get up, and then the balcony goes around the top of that building. This is a counselor in Rec Hall.
That was like an authority figure, and at this point we don't know anything. We weren't told anything. Like, actually in the dark, like, just didn't know what to do. And from my perspective, I was sitting there, like, and we just watched Rec Hall, like, fill up. And, like, the little girls were, like, throwing up. People had to go to the bathroom out of the window. Like, people were going to the restroom in the corner.
The audio is slightly cut off. This is a counselor saying that there was no authority figure in Rec Hall. It was counselors and campers. And what was happening is Rec Hall counselors are the ones that got the girls up onto the balcony because Rec Hall was completely filling up with water. And every single person I interviewed said that they could have reached down through the slats in the balcony and touched water. Counselors described to me that they were thinking through exit plans. They weren't sure if the water was going to keep rising and if they were going to have to get out. Cozy Cabin. Now, Cozy Cabin, I showed you on our site tour, is attached to the front office. Cozy Cabin are the living quarters for the big 3 and the photographers. Again, they're all college-age girls. It is located right there at the front office. It's just separated by that pavilion. These are the members of the big 3 and the other office workers and photographers that were housed in Cozy Cabin. 3 of the big 3 posted on social media that they were awakened at 3:15 to evacuate campers. So a reminder, they have a walkie-talkie. We're not sure who woke them up, but they were awakened at 3:11 to help evacuate campers. This is what was going on in Cozy Cabin. At 3:43 a.m. on the left, and you can see the trunks floating at 3:46 a.m. Notable from these photos in the front office is that the power is still on. Front office is where the PA system is accessible to be used. You can see that this is the pavilion at 3:50 a.m. right outside of that area. Power is still on. You can see the lights still on in the background. At 4:22 a.m., these are members of the Big 3 on the roof of Cozy Cabin. They certainly had their own sort of harrowing experience. One of the Big 3 was almost rushed down the river, but was able to grab on to, I believe, like a volleyball net or something, and sort of miraculously make it back over to the roof. So they sat on the roof. All right, remember the guardhouse. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it is significant. This is where Frances Loper was living. This is where she made her frantic call that the guardhouse is taking on water at about 2:55. You'll notice that the proximity of the guardhouse to the Guadalupe River up here at the top. Bug house is down here. This was her quarters before the flood. This was her quarters after the flood. It was one of the buildings that was completely washed off of its foundation. This is Frances Blackwell Loper's car, found 8 miles down the river, that was parked near the gatehouse. And let me point out, Frances is lucky to be alive. I mean, she had a harrowing experience. She was pushed out onto the porch of her cabin, clung to a column there. Water's rising very quickly. She is thrust down the river. She also believes that she's drowning and going to die. She eventually makes it to a tree like so many people, and she clings to the tree. She spends a week in the hospital. She ends up climbing her way up to Senior Hill, where some of the counselors on Senior Hill help her, and then she's evacuated. So Senior Hill. Senior Hill is that area right there. It is, and you guys saw it from our vantage point. It's elevated. Senior Hill doesn't typically flood. They just are commonly cut off from the rest of the camp by the flooding of the land bridge. But the flood was so bad this time that 2 cabins on Senior Hill also flooded. Counselors on Senior Hill were completely cut off from communication. A counselor on Senior Hill uses a phone that somebody actually kept to call 911 at 3:56 and 3:57 a.m. Some of the main points that she makes in her 911 call is, what do we do? We're completely cut off from the main office. We're completely cut off from communications, and we don't know what to do. They evacuated from their cabins, went kind of higher up to the back where it's a little bit higher to those cabins. Somebody broke into the riflery range cabinet and got a walkie-talkie out. They made numerous calls on the walkie-talkie that apparently went unheard. Okay, now moving towards some of the other areas of the camp that are relevant. We pointed out to you what's called the uptight garage area. That is this area right here. We were standing right by it, over there on that road and up on that little grassy hill. So this is the uptight garage. Okay, these are the adults that were on the flats side of the camp when all of this was happening. Remember, this is Edmondson Creek. So these are the adults that are not isolated from the flats portion. These are the adults that are on the flats side of the camp. In uptight garage, we know there's at least 9 groundskeepers because we saw them in that photo. We know that the groundskeepers were cut off from going farther up that road, up the hill to where their quarters were. So we know that they were down here. We also know that some of the Polish male kitchen workers were in this uptight and garage area. We know that there were 3 nurses in this building right here called Heaven Can Wait, the infirmary. We know that Craig and Betsy Althouse were living in this house right here called Sugar Shack. We know that Richard Eastland, the camp chef, was staying in Granny's cabin. Richard and his wife Leslie were living in this house right here, Pop Inn. But at the time of the flood last year, Pop Inn was being renovated. So they were not living in Pop Inn last year. It was under construction. Leslie was living in a house in town in Ingram and was by herself with her dogs in a home in Ingram. And Richard, because it was camp season and he kept very odd hours, since he had to always get up in the middle of the night to prep for breakfast, he was staying in Granny's cabin. Tweety Eastland's brother, Frank Albritton, was staying in Squeeze Inn, this building right here. And so these are the adults that are on the flats side of Edmondson Creek at the time of all of this flooding. Richard Eastland describes to us that he wakes up kind of in the middle of the night, I think something like 2:30. It's raining, but he is not aware of anything crazy going on. He begins to do some of his work, which is typical for him. It's typical for him to leave his radio off or not have the radio because of his unusual hours. Because he's up at all different hours, he stays off the radio. So he was cut off from communication, was not monitoring the radio the way Britt Eastland was able to do from the Cypress Lake campus. Betsy Althouse looks out her window and starts seeing headlights. She sees cars moving around. She realizes something odd is going on, so she wakes up Craig and says, hey, we need to get up. Something's going on out there. Eventually what happens is Craig and Betsy come outside. Craig describes that he drives a four-wheeler or a 4x4 type vehicle kind of around that corner on the road, realizes the water's way too high, so he comes back. So at some point, you have all of these adults out of their respective cabins and homes, all sort of congregating right here, right off the edge of Uptight Garage. They're standing on this just slightly elevated grassy area. Richard and some of the, maybe the grounds crew, I'm not sure, but somebody goes over to the infirmary and gets the 3 nurses out and brings them back over here to where they're all sort of standing. Now, it's important to know that Richard has 2 daughters in cabins on the flats. He's got a daughter in Bug House, and he's got a daughter in Nut Hut. So one daughter gets evacuated to Rec Hall, one daughter is taken up the hill by her counselor. So it's pretty hard to understand why all these adults were here and just truly lacked information. They had no idea what was going on. I think that is most profoundly illustrated by the fact that Richard had girls in those cabins. If he had known what was going on, I'm sure he wouldn't have been standing with all of these adults on that little grassy area right outside of Uptight Garage. These people were completely deprived of information. It appears from all of the witness interviews that they were completely starved of information. They didn't have specific assignments. They weren't told where to go. They weren't delegated. They weren't given any information on where to go. And essentially, they stayed over in this area and did not take action. And it's a bit of a mystery why. But once the water receded and it became more apparent what was going on, you'll hear in a minute that the grounds crew and Richard and Craig end up walking behind the cabins and come all the way down and start rescuing people out of the bug house tree. So I quickly want to touch on very quickly what's going on the Cypress Lake campsite of things. On the other side of the Bubblegum Creek that you've seen, Ranch House and Cypress Hollow are the residences occupied by Edward and Mary Liz in Ranch House, Tweety and Dick in Cypress Hollow. These are the adults that are on the other side of Edmondson Creek. Mary Liz Eastland is in Ranch House with her 4 sons, ranging in age from 6 to 16. Meredith Martin is in Beehive. Tweety Eastland is in her home in Cypress Hollow, and Britt and Katie Eastland are over on the Cypress Lake campus. There's been much made of what these people were doing at the time of all of this. The reality is they were cut off from at 2:14. I mean, obviously, there was a period between the 1:14 a.m. alert and the 2:01 or 2:14 cutoff of the Edmondson Creek. You know, arguably there was action to be taken between those minutes, but again, at 2:01 and 2:14, there was just nothing to be done. And it's important to know that they were flooding significantly on their, on their own. I should mention that Leslie Eastland almost died in the house that she was in Ingram. She woke up to a massive amount of water, was swept out of her house, and was actually sort of rescued and helped by a lot of those people that ended up on the roof of River Inn. And she rode out the storm there and narrowly escaped drowning herself. Mary Liz and her 4 sons were in Ranch House. They are taking on a significant amount of water. Meredith Martin walks over to Tweety's house because she's terrified and scared and flooding. Mary Liz and her 4 sons walk over to where Meredith and Tweety are at Cypress Hollow. They go inside Cypress Hollow thinking it might be, I think, a little bit safer at that point. Water is rushing in. They start making plans to go up into the attic to get higher when doors burst open and water just floods in the house. So they evacuate from Cypress Hollow and they begin walking up that hill that you saw past those chicken coops up towards Cypress Lake. So they're, again, middle of the night, pitch black, they have flashlights, it's raining, and they're walking up the hill. Mary Liz, her 4 sons, Meredith Martin, and Tweety. As they begin walking up the hill, Britt and Katie Eastland are making their way. Britt and Katie described that during these hours, they are patrolling Cypress Lake. They are, in their vehicle, making rounds of Cypress Lake, trying to make sure their campers are all safe. They begin driving down that road when they hear car alarms and they see a bunch of lights. And what they realize is that right here is a counselor parking lot where multiple cars were parked. Those cars were all floating around and car alarms were going off and headlights were going off. So obviously Britt and Katie, that gets their attention. They start driving down the road and then they start seeing flashlights. And they approach this group of Mary Liz, 4 sons, Meredith and Tweety. Mary Liz says, "Take your mother." Tweety gets into Britt's vehicle. They drive her back to their home called Big Rock right there. And Mary Liz's boys did not want to get into a vehicle. And so Mary Liz, her 4 boys, and Meredith Martin walk all the way up the hill up to Cypress Lake, where they remain until they come back down to deal with what's going on the flats. Daylight and beyond, the aftermath. We're getting there. Richard and the grounds crew and Craig Althouse make their way behind all of the cabins to the bug house tree. The water has started to recede. Of course, it's not completely receded, but they are able to use ladders and ropes, and they're able to get Edward, the little girls, the counselors, and then the other counselor that was alone in a different tree. They are able to evacuate everybody from the bug house tree. Sometime later, a few hundred yards down, the river has to recede even more, and that's when they find Dick's Tahoe with Dick and the 3 little girls in it. Also, at some point on July 4th, we're told approximately between noon and 3, Lucy Dillon is found in the Twins 1 cabin. So those are the deaths that are the bodies that are found, on or near Mystic property. They begin an elaborate evacuation process. Thank God there had been pre-deployed resources. There were helicopters that had been, pre-deployed. There were National Guard trucks. All the girls from Cypress Lake were evacuated via trucks, but all the girls from the Guadalupe River campus were helicoptered out. This is where we move into a period of time that I think should be important to this committee, and not going too far outside of the scope of what happened at Mystic, but the hours right after this event were significant and harrowing for a number of reasons. One of the things we learned in Uvalde, of course, was the importance of incident command. Obviously, incident command is critical in the middle of an event, like an active shooter or a disaster. But we learned a lot about the fact that there's incident command in the post-event response, and there must be incident command in the post-event response because there's so much going on, and things could be handled so much better. Part of the problem with an absolute lack of incident command in those minutes and hours after this event is that there was no rhyme or reason to picking a place for these people to go. I mean, you got to remember now, these people are all getting flooded with text messages and phone calls and trying to figure out what the heck is happening, right? They're waking up in their homes or on vacation or whatever, and they're trying to figure out what's happening. And they all start to make their way to Hunt, right, to be there. They are not really told where to go. They're told to go one place, and then it turns out to be 5 different places. There's no information. There's no good information. Then when there's no information, you guys know what happens when there's no information. Then people fill it with bad information, and that was done in spades. There was just the telephone game, just false information to fill the void of no information. And there was no information because there was no unified incident command. There was nobody truly setting up a command post and making decisions about how to handle the reunification process and how to handle the notification process and how to handle getting information to these parents who had children at that point that were unaccounted for. So it was dreadful misinformation, county officials, sending out messages that all of the girls were accounted for, people saying that, Dick and some girls were on an island or that somebody was in a tree. The misinformation added so much torment and despair to these parents during these hours, and it could have been avoided with proper post-event response. There was a shocking delay of resources that were available being deployed. I had conversations with 2 people involved with the Cajun Navy that were sort of stiff-armed at the very, very beginning and told to stand down, told that they weren't needed. There were other jurisdictions in that area that were eager for them to come, and so they did deploy to those areas. But in the first 24 hours, they were denied access into this area. You're going to hear testimony tomorrow from one of the dads, Michael McCowan, who sort of self-deployed to the camp in the early morning hours of July 5th and was shocked to get there and see not a single search and rescue person searching. I think the most telling lack of search and rescue is that Michael actually found a child's body, and he was completely alone and had no idea what to do. And so that was clearly the job of search and rescue, and it was clearly not being done. Meanwhile, Hunter Burns and Josh Gill of the Cajun Navy have thermal drones, helicopters, hundreds of off-duty firefighters, off-duty policemen, certified search and rescue people that are ready to go out there that were sort of pushed back. And a proper incident commander would have accepted their resources. They described being in Center Point where there was an incident commander, one of the fire department officials, and they were like, come on, we need you, right? And that was not done here, and that was really unfortunate. One of the things that as a 33-year criminal lawyer, it's sort of hard to shock me with human behavior, but I was so shocked and so devastated when these parents, each and every one of them, told me that because they had made a decision to put their daughter's picture and their personal cell phones onto social media because they were so hopeful that some Grant Griffin had plucked their daughter off of a debris pile, or some sister 6 miles downriver had plucked their daughter off of a debris pile. They were so desperate. Here's my daughter. If you've seen her, please call me. Prank calls all night long. All night long. And they had to answer their phone because they didn't know if it was somebody legitimate. I'm talking about people going, I've got your daughter. Here she is. Mommy. The most cruel human behavior that you can imagine. Now, is there anything that you can do about cruel human behavior? No. Okay? But incident command could have. They could have said, no, guys, don't put your phone numbers out there. We're going to set up a tip line. We'll monitor the tip line. That's our job, not yours. Those prank phone calls have gone on for a year. Parents have told me they've gotten them as recently as 2 weeks ago. Okay? Again, you can't manage the cruelty of the world, but you can make a difference on how we respond in crisis management to avoid that kind of utter torture. Parents described to me that there was an element of relief to finding their daughters' bodies just so that they knew. Just so that they knew. A huge disaster with autopsies. One JP saying that there's mandatory autopsies, the other JP saying not. Girls' bodies being transferred to ME's offices without parents being told. A disaster, an absolute disaster. Parents not wanting autopsies that were performed. A total lack of incident command. The death note. And I do want to point out here, in any crisis, people are doing the best they can. I mean, there were volunteers. There were people trying so hard. The same thing happened in Uvalde. People meant so well. They wanted to take action, but they weren't told what to do. And same thing here. People meant well. Volunteers meant well. They cared. But you can't self-deploy as a volunteer. You have to have somebody telling you what to do. And that was absent. And it added to human despair. It added to torment. There was no getting those babies back. They were gone, but it could have helped somewhat in this process. The death notification process was a disaster in the first few hours. You had parents showing up to Grimes Funeral Home, identifying their daughter, recognizing another girl and being told, hey, can you call them? I mean, no. Yeah, I mean, we can do better, but we can't do better unless we dispatch people that know what they're doing, right? Unless we get an incident commander down there, whoever it is. That's what you guys are the experts on that. Is it a ranger? Is it a strike force that's on call that can go anywhere in the state of Texas and set up incident command and mass casualties? I don't know. That's what we're looking to you for, but something's got to happen, and it was just as bad in Uvalde. This is a picture of the reunification center. It was complete chaos. I think I've made my point on that. Now we get to the really hard part. What I've been calling the impact crater, which is so deep and so wide and so incomprehensible. I mean, the palpable grief of these families that are sitting in this courtroom, the absolute grief of the Eastland family, which is very, very real. We left our interviews with them extremely empathetic towards them as well. They're a highly traumatized family. But I mean, the stories I've heard about, the siblings, the brothers at home that can't stand it, the sisters that were there, the sister that walked her little sister from the infirmary and tucked her into her cabin, and hours later she was gone. The cousin from Senior Hill that tucked her little baby cousin in, and hours later she was gone. I mean, I cannot describe to you what is going on. Grandparents who are trying to deal with their child's pain, but also their own grief of losing a grandchild. I mean, it's just so pervasive. The relationships that have been destroyed, the generational relationships that have been destroyed here, the impact crater is unbelievable, okay? It's just shattering. But that emotion needs to be commented on, but it's certainly not what the emotion gives us the passion to have a call to action, but it's really logic and common sense and reason that gets the job done, right? That's going to be what you guys do after these hearings. And I'm gonna give you a quote from, I was sitting in the Hollis's farmhouse in Belleville, and after hearing their heart-wrenching story, Lacey Hollis said something so logical and so reasonable and so common sense. And it's really the call to action for this committee. And that is, she tearfully told me, I just want parents to look at their child after camp and know that they were kept safe and not lucky. And it wasn't just Mystic. Guys, it was not just Mystic. You have a big job to do, because it was all those camps where kids were just lucky. They were either lucky that they weren't in session, they were lucky that their session hadn't started, they were lucky that the cabin they were in floating down the river, they just didn't die. Taking nothing away from God's miracles. They were God's miracles, but it wasn't camp safety. So that's a wrap from me. I welcome your questions. I will say one last thing. Along with all of the people in this room from both sides and our amazing team and all the lawyers, we are hungry. We are hungry for this committee to do your thing. I mean, you're powerful people that can answer this call to action, and every single one of the people in this room and listening are hungry for that action. So thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present this to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Garrett. Thank you for that very impactful, meaningful presentation to our committee. It is the committee's intention to recess for 1 hour and return for a question and answer period with the investigators. Without objection, the committee will recess until 1:36 p.m. The committee stands recessed.
So the Senate General Investigating Committee on July 2025 flooding events will recess until 1:36 p.m., at which time the committee will reconvene to continue today's meeting.